So I had a friend once who used to always say to me, Anna, you don't actually have to always confess everything. But I always kind of liked confession. I mean, technically I was baptized Catholic, so maybe somewhere in the water it got into my brain. I never really became a practicing Catholic, but my childhood was not altogether unreligious. In fact, I actually chose on my own to get into the evangelical church. A friend of mine in middle school had invited me to youth group, and the only reason I kept going was because my mom was super restrictive about me hanging out with boys, but somehow youth group and church camp made the cut, and so I thought this was a phenomenal loophole, so I joined the evangelical church. And even at a young age, I understood there were some rules to this. There were sort of two main pillars to this church. There was salvation, right? You've got to give your life over. And then at this point, you sort of get this like armor. There's like a low-key hint that you might actually be able to cheat death somehow. And you're just like, you're good to go. You can almost do anything afterwards, but as long as you're saved, you're good to go. And then there was this other pillar that was really more for women or girls, which was keep your legs shut. So I figured if I can just nail these two things, I am good to go in life. And I get to go to church camp with boys. So this was really something that they like tried to get in ink for us, literally. I remember going to this Christian rap concert over here in Udall Park, and they gave us this presentation. This is like peak 90s. The purity movement is in full force. The AIDS epidemic is all we're talking about. And they gave us this scary, scary presentation and then made us sign on the dotted line a virginity pledge. They laminated the card, and I wish I still had it, but I don't know where that is. And when I signed this card, I mostly meant it. I thought this sounded like a doable thing. But then I found myself in college in my first serious relationship, and he had not taken the same pledge I had. And so this became an issue in our relationship, but I figured we were in a serious enough relationship, we were in love, like we eventually did talk about marriage, and so I figured I can't break my vow for this because I've like mostly gotten there, right? And so we get into this relationship, it goes on for years, and then I find myself at 22, I've graduated, and then we're engaged, and I'm thinking, wait, hold on. So like, you're the only person, like forever? Then I start rethinking this logic. And so for a variety of reasons, I decide to end the relationship, and I found myself at 23, single, ready to mingle, ready to catch up on lost time. And so in 1 3-month, like hot girl summer in 2007, I caught up on lost time, sowed my wild oats, and ended up with an unplanned pregnancy that I chose to terminate. And at this point, I realized, oh shit, like the evangelical church is right. Like sex is wrong, there are consequences, I'm a bad person, and I had nowhere to go with this feeling. I felt like I needed to be forgiven by somebody, I needed to be redeemed, and I had nowhere else that I'd ever found this sort of language, and so I took myself back into the evangelical church that I'd let go of years ago. And I was a good studious girl. I was there like with my journal, taking like notes on Sunday from the preacher and everything. And the rules had stayed the same. Salvation, keep your legs shut. And at this point, it felt kind of corny to be like, I'm a born-again virgin. But I started to say things like, well, then my next partner will be my last partner. And I'm doing okay there. And then I met a gentleman who did not share the same pledge. And we had really strong chemistry. And so after about a couple months of us debating this, he won, but honestly, I didn't even mind. Our chemistry was really good. Again, we were in love. I was so sure he was the one. So I was like, it's sort of like the intent of the rule that counts, right? And so we have this, great relationship, and it comes time for me to meet his parents. And I don't know who actually agreed to this, but we decided I was going to meet his parents on an Ash Wednesday service. They went to this Episcopal church. We were living in Portland at the time, and as we were getting closer to this day, and I'm getting ready to go and meet his parents in a church at an Ash Wednesday service, I start to get these like waves of shame, like, oh my God, does he know what kind of woman he's bringing to his parents? Like, am I good enough? Am I worthy? Like, do they, like, all of it just seemed like, I don't know if I'm ready for this, and I don't think that, like, maybe I'm enough. And so the night before this Ash Wednesday service, I decide I'm going to confess every single sexual thing I've ever done in my entire life, and I wrote it up in a Word doc, and then I emailed it to him.
Oh my God.
And then I waited. He calls me right away and he says, "Can I come over?" I said, "Yes." So he's coming over and I'm waiting and I'm just on the edge of my seat thinking, like, what's the verdict gonna be? Is it a yes or no? Am I good enough? Does he approve? I don't know. And he comes into my apartment and he's looking at me and his face looks somewhere between fear and confusion. And I'm trying to just figure out where what's he come up with? And he comes over and he holds me and he says, "You don't actually have to do any of this, you know? I mean, if it makes you feel better, I've done way worse than this, but you don't need to do this. Like, it's not necessary." And so I'm sort of comforted by his words. And then he very gently kisses me on my forehead. And with this, I feel cleansed, I feel purified, I feel blessed, I'm redeemed, I'm forgiven, and I decide I'm gonna meet his parents. And so we go to this service, and as lovely as he was, on time, he was not. And so we were very late to this service, and we show up to this towering church in downtown Portland. There's these dark gray bricks. There's those familiar red doors if you've ever been to an Episcopal church. And we walk in, and there's what looks like 50 rows full of people. And the service is well underway, and I'm ready to just jump into the last pew, as one does at this situation. But then I realized that his parents are actually very prominent in this church, and they're really big donors, which means that they have reserved seating all the way in the front. And so we just kind of like gingerly walk our way up there, and I try to jump into the pews, and I'm sitting there, and I look to my left, and I see his mom, and I wave, and I don't see his dad. And then I see his dad is on the altar, and I realized he was a Eucharistic minister, and we were just about to do communion. So we lined up, and I haven't met him, remember? So my first meeting of him is walking up with my hand out, just like ready for my wafer, and then he's actually putting it into our mouth, so I'm there like, and with my eyes, I'm trying to communicate like, "It's really nice to meet you." And then I go, and I sit back down. It's funny for y'all, okay? So we're sitting there, and the father does eventually join us, and he proceeds to kneel on the pew thing, I don't know, the entire time. Like, he's more religious than a Catholic. They get up and sit and stand a little bit. He's on there the whole time, and I'm trying to like match him a little bit, but then like it hurts because it's wood, so I start to do the thing where you're like sitting and then like putting your knees forward. I don't know if anybody's done that. And we get through the service, they're lovely, we get along. As it turns out, this was a completely unfounded fear, because even though Episcopalians, I don't know, they have very serious looking services, but their theology is actually quite liberal. And if anything, they were much more scared of me and my evangelical stuff than anything they were doing. They would see me reading my Bible every single day and be like, "Is she born again? Like, what's her deal?" So over time, I somewhat released some of the guilt over this. I also released the evangelical church, and it was the right move to make for sure. But as I've thought about this story over the years, particularly this moment, I have sort of two thoughts that I've had. As it was closer to the event, especially when we were still together, I used to think of it as this really sweet moment that we shared. I got to be fully seen and accepted and loved, and that was a beautiful moment. But then after we split, and as time went on, I was like, yeah, but why did I feel like I needed his approval or any man's approval for specifically my sexual acts? Like, there was nothing else that we ever talked about. It was just this. And so I've just been sitting with this over the years. And, you know, I've made peace with the fact that, like, you can't actually cheat death. So I didn't, I never needed their salvation any more than I needed his forgiveness. And I've made peace with all these things. But when you release those types of external things, you're sort of left with like, well, then what do you actually think? And so now, my faith looks a lot more like just mystery and questions. Questions like, how do I feel about sex? Do I like it? With whom? I don't know. What do I like to do? How do I feel about my abortion? Do I need to be forgiven? And if so, by whom? But I don't actually need answers to those questions, because again, I've released this need for the certainty of all this. However, I do think that there's one thing that y'all can help me find some closure on, because I started off by saying I love a good confession, but I've also only confessed sexual things, And I've done some other naughty things that I'd like to get off my chest tonight. So just a few, just to whet your palate, but in no particular order, except it's chronological. When I was 8, I stole bubble gum from a grocery store because my dad didn't let us have sugar in the house. When I was 14, I borrowed $15 from my mom to go to a Christian rock concert, and I bought marijuana. When I was 16, I got caught shoplifting and I peed my pants, and it's a double confession. And then the last one, which is like the weirdest one, but it does still haunt me, is I left this job when I was 28, and I had purchased myself this leather-bound, really beautiful maroon like notebook where I'd have my like notepads and everything. And when I quit, I took it and I didn't ask permission. So thank you for hearing my confessions. I did bring my rosary tonight, so if anybody knows how many Hail Marys that gets me, I will be sitting right there. Just let me know. Thank you.